But let's get to Paul tonight. We're going to be looking at Paul bound for scourging. That's not a very pleasant topic. I'm not going to go into gory details about scourging. I'm sure you've heard some of these before. We'll go into it enough to understand what this is, and some of what you've heard may not quite be right. Or it depends on who you read. You read different things, and so I'll tell you where I've come in my understanding of scourging and what's going on there. But here you see that Roman soldier. What he is doing in that picture, he's telling the fella back there holding the scourge, that's the whip. They're about to whip this man that's tied to this post with his bare back. He's telling them, no, don't do that. Because Paul is going to reveal to those who are about to scourge him that he is a Roman and that you couldn't scourge. You're not supposed to scourge a Roman. So we'll get into this. We'll be looking at these things again. But in this study tonight, the only person that is identified by name is Paul. So we'll just have Paul go ahead and put, and I've got it highlighted every time it shows up. We are going to go back a little bit in the last Sunday night where we were talking about Stephen. You remember Paul had gone into the temple, and there were Jews from Asia that were against Paul, and when they saw Paul in the temple, they raised the cry that Paul had brought Gentiles into the temple. Well, Paul had been associating with Gentiles, but he hadn't brought any into the temple, not where the Gentiles were not supposed to go. But the Jews, hearing this, were raised into a furor. They dragged Paul out of that part of the temple. And in the temple grounds itself, out in the court of the Gentiles, they were preparing to beat Paul to death. When he's rescued by the Romans, they carry him to the steps of the castle. And this man, bloodied, dirtied, clothes ripped, beaten. And he says, "Can I talk to the people?" And they're letting him preach now from the steps of that. Everyone got quiet, and he started talking to them in the Hebrew tongue, and they got very quiet. And they were listening intently to Paul, but it was very, very tense. Just any little thing was about to set them off. And so Paul, as he's speaking, talks about the blood of thy martyr Stephen. He remembers. He was part of that crowd that had stoned Stephen to death. He even identified himself at the beginning, says, "I know how zealous you are. I was too." And he remembers being part of that mob, those angry Jews that unlawfully had stoned Stephen to death. And Paul's facing that kind of a crowd now. He says, "I was consenting to his death, kept the raiment of them that slew him." Now note that. They took their raiment off, their outer clothes, so they would better be able to cast the stones at Stephen. And he said unto me, "Depart, for I'll send thee far thence to the Gentiles." That was it. That set them off. That one word. They had listened in very quiet but tense silence until he said Gentiles. They gave him audience unto this word, lifted up their voices and said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth. It's not fit that he should live." You'd wonder how one word like that could so inflame that crowd. But it reminds me of that riot in Ephesus, where they brought Alexander out. When they had all entered the stadium and they brought Alexander out, he was going to explain, this wasn't the Jews that were doing this. It's Paul. He's not part of us. But someone says, he's a Jew. And that one word, Jew, they found out he was a Jew, and they cried out, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians. Great is Diana of the Ephesians," and did that for hours. And so here you kind of see the reverse of that. That one word, Gentiles. This should kind of register in your memory what's going on here and the mighty tensions that had been building up across Rome, and especially in Jerusalem, concerning the Jews and the Romans. It would not be many years in which it would be so out of hand that the Romans would say, we're just going to completely destroy the city. Well, it was building here at this time, and you see that tension. So, we begin tonight. Acts chapter 22, 23. And as they cried out, look what they did. They cast off their clothes and threw dust in the air. That's like, it means like this. I took my coat off. You've seen people do that. They take their coat off so they can be freer. What are they doing that for? Well, when they did that with Stephen, it was so they could stone him. And so now they're taking off their clothes. They're ready. They're going to do something. And then they just threw dust in the air. It's like it was a mindless mob, just so angry. I worked with a fella that had been part of the riots at Ohio State University during the Vietnam War. While Nixon was president, he had been a student there. And some of you, this is news to you. But some of us remember seeing that on TV, the way and they actually brought the National Guard out, and some of the students were shot. There were just terrible riots, and he was one of those doing those riots. He said, we ran up and down the streets turning cars over. That's what he said they did. And he knew better than to do that. But caught up in this mob, they just exploding and just doing things without thinking. And he wasn't even sure why they were doing it. But everyone was upset turning cars. And he got in there and started helping them turn cars over. So that sounds kind of like what's happening here. And they're throwing dust in the air. With the chief captain, he's responsible for keeping things in order. And he had gone out there to rescue Paul, even though they were really just trying to find out what's going on. The chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle. Here it is, the castle. Antonia. I think that's the right way to say it. The castle was called Antonia. It was that, and I showed you that last time, that castle built right off of the temple grounds, where the Romans could overlook those temple grounds and see what's going on down there, because they want to keep peace. It's where the Roman armies, the centurions, would lodge their soldiers so that they would be ready to keep that peace. Named for Mark Antony. Remember, Paul is from Taurus. Mark Antony was in Taurus during the days of Paul's grandfather, at the time when Cleopatra had come up on her barge, and he just became so attached and fascinated with her that he just lost his ability to rule that kingdom. They went down to Egypt, and it's a very tragic affair that occurred with Mark Antony and Cleopatra. They both died there in Egypt. Well, that's who this was named for. Herod had built this, and when the Mark Antony was on the rise, he had named it for Mark Antony. Well, they took him to the tower and bade that he should be examined by scourging. That sounds like a tough test, doesn't it? Examined by scourging. Here's the idea. We'll strip you to your bare back and tie you across a post and whip you across that back a few times, and you'll tell us anything that we ask you. Like you've seen in the movies sometime where they say, we have ways of finding out. We have ways of making you talk. And so they're going to examine him by scourging. That sounds very cruel and brutal, doesn't it? Rome was a cruel, brutal empire. Perhaps that's why Daniel, when he was describing the Roman Empire, would associate them with the iron and the iron legs of that Roman Empire. That's what defined Rome. So we'll find out. We'll just examine you by scourging. And so, there they are. This is what scourging is. That little whip you see over there is called a scourge. And the picture I have there, it's got nine whip pieces on it. Each one of those 9 are tipped with some kind of little sharp instrument, a piece of flint or a broken piece of glass or stone, so it would rip your back. And then these scourgers, see, they knew how to do this. They knew how to plant that thing on your back where it would rip into you and then jerk to really make damage occur on that back. I said I wouldn't go into the bad details, but I did just a little bit there. Well, I've read these things about scourging, and there was a formal scourging that would occur, and it was so severe that oftentimes the one being scourged would not survive. But that's not the way people were always scourged. And that's what I want us to remember. You're not always scourged to that severity. Maybe just scourged just enough, just whip him a couple of and get him to talk. As long as he's talking, we'll hold off, something like that. So it may not have always been that kind of severity as that formal scourging, which was really to prepare a man for death. So let's get back to that in just a minute. Here we read about in Hebrews 11:39, when it's talking about the great heroes of faith. And right at the end of Hebrews 11, some of the things in that account are things that occurred not in the Old Testament, but in that period of time between the Testaments. And it says that others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings. That had become common in that culture. John chapter 2 and verse 15, Jesus did some scourging. Now it says that when he is Jesus, he made a scourge of small cords. He drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen. Well, he wasn't beating people till they were nearly dead when he was scourging them. The scourge is just that instrument they'd use to whip. And it doesn't even say he scourged any person. When you read it carefully, he's using that scourge to drive the sheep and oxen out of the temple. Sometime I've heard it said, and I may have said it before I knew better, that he took that whip and drove the people out of the temple. But what he's talking about is driving the sheep and oxen out, overturning the money changers and driving the animals out of the temple with that scourge. Matthew 10 and verse 17, Jesus told his apostles, "Beware of men. They will deliver you up to the councils." Well, it'd be like a Sanhedrin, and they'll scourge you in their synagogues. What if we had a place to scourge folks here at church? You know, they come in here and we'll just drag them up here and we'll scourge them right here in the church house. Well, they would do it right in the synagogues. They would scourge them for preaching the truth to them. And then Paul himself was among those that were going into those synagogues trying to find Christians. And he himself may have participated in some of that scourging. Acts chapter 16, 22 through 23. It doesn't specifically say scourging, but this is when Paul is in Philippi, and it certainly sounds like a scourging. The magistrates rent off their clothes, see, so they could really get to them, and commanded to beat them, and they made many stripes on them and cast them into prison. Now, these are the Romans. There weren't many Jews, if any, in the city of Philippi, but there were Romans there, and they scourged Paul and Silas. This may not have been one of those formal scourgings, but it was enough to rough them up and then thrust them into that inner prison for the night, and it was an unlawful thing for them to do. And so the next morning, they kind of found out they came hand in hand just asking him if he would just leave. 2 Corinthians 11, 23 through 25, Paul says he was in stripes above measure. Now, the measure was 49 stripes. That's the way I've read that that's how many, because you aren't supposed to beat them over 50 times. So they beat them 49 times, or is it 39? Anyway, they'd stop there just before they went over the limit. Now, but he went beyond measure. They scourged him beyond measure. Stripes. That would be the wounds that come from scourging. But then he says of the Jews, 5 times received 40 stripes, save one. Okay, so it's 39 times. The Jews did it within measure, and they scourged him 5 times. And it was unlawful for them to do that. He had suffered at least 6 unlawful scourgings. And to be hit with 39 stripes, that's a pretty severe scourging, wasn't it? Now, you go back into the story about Paul and his missionary journeys, and Luke doesn't mention these scourgings. It mentions the one by the Romans in Philippi, but it doesn't mention the Jewish scourgings that Paul endured and when it was that he endured that. I wonder if it could have been that time from the time he'd left Jerusalem until the time that Barnabas came and got him and brought him to Antioch. There was a period about 7 years there that we don't read about Paul. Could it have been during that time? I suppose it could. But now Luke doesn't record everything. However, Luke does tell us about the first missionary journey where Paul and Barnabas went to the island of Cyprus and crossed the island of Cyprus and came to Paphos. Now, you can go to Paphos today, and one of the things you will see is this pillar here, and it's called Paul's Pillar. You see the walkway behind that? That's so tourists can go over there and look down and see what the archaeologists are doing. And in the background is a church that the Greek Orthodox Church had built kind of as a memorial to Paul. And the tradition is that Paul was strapped to that pillar for a scourging on the Isle of Cyprus there. Now, I don't know that they can substantiate that, but that's what's been passed down through the years. And Paul did say 5 times I was scourged. I received those stripes from the Jews. So it could very well be. And if it wasn't that, it was somewhere that 5 times Paul had been strapped to one of these pillars and he had been scourged. So they bound him to one of those pillars. They had one in the castle. They bound him with thongs. Now, I tried to find pictures to show you what they're doing. I didn't want to search thongs and see what I could come up with. I think you know why. So what I did, I searched for binding thongs. Well, that didn't work. I didn't want to see that, okay? Binding thongs. A thong is a strip of leather. And the idea was that that's what they used to tie Paul to that pillar, these strips of leather. Well, maybe so. But I've read other translations, and I've looked into the Greek, beginning to question this. And when it says they bound him with thongs, it means they stretched him. That's what it means to bind him. The idea means to be that they stretched him for the thongs. Well, that may have been the thongs on those strips of leather on that scourge. That gives a little different picture. But this binding was a stretching. Here's what they do. They bind him on that pillar so that he's pulled around and his back skin is taut so that scourge could do the more damage and really whip a taut back that has been stretched on there. And that is found in these words, that is the significance of that binding him. That's the King James Version, but looking at and I got some Bibles that are really just really trying to be very accurate, and it says they stretched him 4 thongs. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Now, Paul stopped them. Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? Now, I guess you could scourge a Roman if he was condemned, had gone through a trial, but Paul hadn't been through a trial. They were going to scourge him to get information out of him. What have you done? We'll just scourge you and find out. He says, is that lawful? Of course, he knew it wasn't lawful. He knew they knew. And so he appealed to his Roman citizenship to protect him from being scourged by that pillar. And that changed the picture real quick. See, the Romans were cruel, but they were lawful. So when the centurion heard that, he went and told the chief captain, saying, take heed what thou doest. This man is a Roman. The chief captain came and said to him, tell me, art thou a Roman? He said, yes. The chief captain said, with great sum obtained I this freedom. Paul said, I was freeborn. There's different ways to become a Roman. One is you're born to a Roman. In the city of Rome, you're born to the Romans from the city of Rome, and so you're a Roman. You receive it by birth. Paul's parents weren't Romans. They were Jews. He was of the tribe of Benjamin. Well, up in Tarsus, when Cicero, you may have heard of Cicero from the Roman Senate, he had been sent to rule over that part of the country from Tarsus, and while he was there, the Sabians were making an attack, and he asked for volunteers out of Tarsus and raised up an army and fought them off and granted those volunteers Roman citizenship. That could have been Paul's grandfather among those. That may have been how that came. At any rate, Paul's father was a Roman. He was a Jew that had Roman citizenship. And so Paul was born a Roman, and that was supposed to be a better way to become a Roman than purchasing it. Some would bribe officials to get that designation, but not necessarily a bribe. If there was a great need for funds, they could call out, and if this chief captain had given lots of funds at a time when they were greatly needed, maybe part of the reward was to make him a Roman. But in any way, he had purchased it. Paul was born a Roman. And the Roman way of looking at things, that put Paul as superior to the chief captain that was about to scourge him under the law. Well, straightway they departed from him. That would have they got out of there. I can just see the soldiers that were, they're going to leave the room. They don't want any part of this. And the chief captain also was afraid because he knew that he was a Roman because he had bound him. You weren't even supposed to bind a Roman. And yet, that chief captain, I guess he had a sleepless night. He may have thought of that during the night. Said, oh man, I even bound him, because he didn't unbind him till the next morning. It says, on the morrow, because he would have known certainly whereof he was accused of the Jews, he loosed him from his bands. He must have left him bound all night, and that wasn't lawful to do. But they released him from his bands, commanded the chief priest and all the council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. The council, this is the Sanhedrin. They had brought Stephen in and accused Stephen, and his face glowed like an angel when he addressed that council. And now Paul is being brought into that same governing body, that council, for his trial. Well, let's look at the teachings. I got a little bit to add here about scourging, because our Lord was scourged. He was scourged awfully. It wasn't just a few whips to get some information. They prepared him for his death. John 19 and verse 1, Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him. That's how they prepared a criminal for crucifixion. And we read in Isaiah 53 and verse 5 that with his stripes we are healed. The prophet had spoken of how Jesus would be striped with those wounds, and it was fulfilled when Pilate had him scourged, and as Jesus received those stripes, so we received our healing, the propitiation for our sins. That's why he did that. And it justifies God and saying, I can forgive them because Christ stepped in to be that propitiation. My son did. So now I can be just and the justifier of man. But also Hebrews chapter 12. And have ye forgotten the exhortation which speaketh unto you as unto children? My son, despise not thou the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him. For whom the Lord loveth, he chastiseth and scourgeth every son whom he received. What's that talking about? Tell you what, you're raising your boy, and he's going to be rebellious. You didn't put up with it. You take him out and whip him, that's what you do. You'd have him scourged. Now, certainly this wasn't preparing him for death. It wouldn't have been that severe of a scourging. But he's talking about those Jews that had suffered. He said, yes, but the Lord loves you. He doesn't want you behaving this way. That's why you're suffering like this. He's like a father that loves his son enough to discipline his son. If ye endure chastising, God dealeth with you as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father chastiseth not? But ye be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then are ye bastards and not sons. Furthermore, we had our fathers in our flesh, which corrected us, and we gave them reverence. Shall we not much rather be in subjection unto the Father of spirits and live? For verily for a few days chastiseth us, and after our own pleasure, but he for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastising for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless afterward it yieldeth peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. Does anybody here remember their father giving them a whipping? Does anybody remember that? I remember that. You know what I would do when my father would whip me? When my father got through whipping me, I'd turn around and hug his neck. I mean, I know that's a strange psychology, but I knew what Daddy was doing. He loved me, and he did not want to see me turn into the kind of young man he thought I was going to. And so, not out of anger, not out of a fit, but out of a loving discipline, he whipped me, and I hugged his neck. I knew it was for my good. And so it is for our own good when God chastiseth us, but he uses that word scourges. Isn't that interesting? But now there's something else here on the teachings I want us to look at, and then I'll let you have the lesson, and that is about citizenship. Paul had multiple citizenships, and we see three of them in this story. One is he is a Jew. I'm a Jew. He was of the tribe of Benjamin. Among the Jews, he's among the Jews. And being a Jew, there was this ethnic responsibility you had. And so the Sanhedrin, remember when the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem sent Paul to Damascus with papers? Well, he couldn't have authority over everyone, but that Sanhedrin had authority over Jews throughout the Roman Empire. And so Paul was a Jew of the Commonwealth of Israel. That's one. But he's also a citizen of the city of Tarsus. Now, that may not have been good outside of Tarsus, but in Tarsus, there would have been special privileges associated with being a citizen of Tarsus. And the centurion, he knew that. The captain, Paul explained to him, this is when Paul is telling him on the steps, aren't you that Egyptian? He said, no, I'm a Jew, a citizen of Tarsus, of a city of Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city. So the chief captain knew he was a citizen of Tarsus, But just because you're a citizen of Tarsus didn't mean you were a Roman citizen. And so in Acts 22 and verse 27, when the chief captain said, "Tell me, art thou Roman?" he said, "Yes." 3 citizenships. And that helps us understand how Paul was a prepared and chosen vessel of God to preach the gospel in that world at that time. Those 3 cultures overlapped on Paul. Being a Jew, being Greek, as a citizen of Tarsus, which is a Greek city, and being a Roman citizen as well. All 3 cultural influences that cross over this one man, making him a special type of person prepared to carry the gospel into that Greek and Roman world and to begin in those synagogues. Isn't that just interesting how God had prepared him? But there's one other citizenship he had. That's 3, but there's another one, and it's the one that we can have. And we find this in Philippians 3, 20 and 21. Now, the King James Version says, "Our conversation is in heaven." Well, that's probably not the best way to translate that word. It's never translated conversation elsewhere in the King James Version, and the word translated conversation is a different word. But a better word for that in this passage would be the word citizen. And with the American Standard Version, it began to be translated citizen, and I think most translations after that pick right up on that and translate it that way. Our citizenship is in heaven. Oh yeah, he's writing to the Philippians. Remember, that's where he had declared his Roman citizenship to those inhabitants of Philippi. They were proud to be Romans. But he's writing to that church that no doubt had Romans in it, like that very guard that had guarded him that night. He says, yeah, but our citizenship is greater than anything on this earth. You think it's good to be a Roman citizen? I know it is. That's helped me. But greater than that is the citizenship we have in heaven. Look what he says. Our citizenship is in heaven, from whence also we look for the Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, who shall change our vile body, that it may be fashioned like unto his glorious body, according to the working whereby he is able even to subdue all things unto himself. Paul is a citizen of heaven, and we can be a citizen of heaven. When Nicodemus came to Jesus by night, Nicodemus is a Jewish citizen. Jesus knew what he was there for, before Nicodemus could even answer. He said, except a man be born again, he cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, Nicodemus had been born into the Jewish commonwealth and was prominent there. You got to be born again, not of flesh and blood, but of water and of the Spirit. And except a man be born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. A spiritual birth. Most of us here have become citizens of the United States. Some may be naturalized. Lena, I don't know, you naturalized? But most of us were born into the citizenship of the United States. Lena became naturalized and became a citizen of this country. But what we need is a citizenship in heaven. And so we need to be born again, buried with him in baptism, rise to walk now as a citizen of a kingdom that shall stand forever. That's where Paul was, and that's where you need to be. And so if you need to respond to the invitation, do it while we stand.